Imagine that I'm downtown, just walking around, going shopping, which I never do, but it's a story, so work with me here. So I'm walking around, and I notice Shelley on the other side of the street. She just happens to be down there at the same time. And I holler to her, but she can't hear me because there's too much noise with the cars and stuff. And I can't run across the street to greet her because there's too many cars. And so I'm just going to watch her, and I'll wait till we get to the street corners, and then I'll cross over and greet her. So I'm fondly watching my wife, and as I am watching her, she comes upon a panhandler, a guy in a wheelchair. Looks like he's a veteran or something. He's wearing a veteran's cap. He's selling these little pencils with flags on the top, and he's got a jar to put money in. And as I'm seeing Shelley approach this man, I'm thinking, oh, she's probably going to empty her wallet. I know my wife. I've been married 37 years, and I know her to be so generous and so compassionate. She's probably going to give this guy more than we can afford. But imagine if, as I'm watching her, she approaches this man, and when she gets up to him, she all of a sudden just lets out this blood-curdling scream at this guy's face, starts calling him names, and then smashes his pencils out into the street and smashes his money jar in the other direction, and then takes off the guy's cap and slaps him in the face, and then kicks over his wheelchair, and then takes off running. I'd be like, whoa! Menopause is one thing, but this is going out of control. Just kidding. Oh, it's like, what on earth? And I know that's my wife. I had a clear view of her, but how should I process this? Now, on the one hand, I could think to myself, gosh, 37 years of marriage, and you think you know somebody, and turns out she's got this cruel streak in her. She's probably been sneaking out on Friday afternoons to abuse panhandlers my whole marriage. I could think that. But see, that'd be unfaithful to my marriage. It calls into question the authenticity of our relationship. I know my wife, and there's not a cruel streak in her. So if I'm confident in her character, the only alternative then is to assume that something else was going on here. More's going on than meets the eye. It couldn't be the case that she was actually doing what it looked like she was doing. And so I would try to think of scenarios that would explain this. I would maybe imagine, maybe she got recruited into some kind of a sociological experiment, and there's some social scientists who are making observations about the way people respond to atrocious situations. And so she and this panhandler were just kind of play acting. Or maybe I would think that she's got on some reality television show, and they're capturing people's horrified looks on their faces because it's going to be really funny when they show it on cable TV later on. Or maybe it's one of those punked shows. You ever see the show Punked? Maybe I'm being punked right now. Maybe somehow she found out I was going to be down there, and there's a camera on me right now capturing the horrified look on my face. Or maybe she's part of maybe the FBI recruited her because this guy's a terrorist. He's plotting a terrorist attack, and the FBI saw how friendly she was to him every day, and so they recruited her, and she's supposed to cause this major distraction to disrupt the terrorist plot. Okay, they're really out there, I know. And these all seem wildly implausible. But if I'm confident that Shelley is not cruel, the implausible becomes plausible. Yeah, they're a stretch, but they're not as much a stretch as thinking that Shelley could actually be cruel. That is kind of the situation that we're in when we're talking about these violent portraits of God. On the one hand, as I always preach here, and I can't take the time to prove this now. If you're visiting, you're just going to have to trust us on this one. But we're always saying that we're called, the covenant we're a part of is, we're called to trust that God's character is fully revealed in Jesus Christ, whose ministry and identity is centered on the cross. That the cross isn't just one revelation among others. The cross is the full revelation of God. Jesus is the very radiance of God's glory and the exact likeness of his very essence, Hebrews 1:3. Jesus says, if you see me, you see the Father. You don't have to look anywhere else to see the Father. So we're called to trust that God looks exactly like Jesus. And Jesus reveals a God who would give his life for every person he ever created. He thought every human being has unsurpassable worth and is worth dying for. This is a God who would rather die at the hands of his enemies than to slaughter his enemies. This is a God he'd rather bear the sin of people, bear their sin, than punish them for their sin. This is a God who is opposed to all violence and therefore tells us to be opposed to all violence. And a God who loves his enemies and tells us to love our enemies, and to bless enemies and therefore tells us to bless enemies. This is a God whose very essence is self-sacrificial love, whose very essence is this nonviolent, self-sacrificial, enemy-embracing, sin-bearing love. That's the God that Jesus reveals. And our call is to trust that that's what he's really like. Now, Jesus, who we call Lord, and I've got good reasons for believing he's Lord, he endorses the Old Testament as fully inspired by God. He quotes it all the time. It's part of his identity. It's a central aspect of who he is. He believes it's all inspired. And if I call him Lord, well, then I can't disagree with him. You can't call someone Lord and then correct their theology. So I'm obliged to consider the whole Bible to be God-breathed, as Paul says in 2 Timothy 3. God-breathed. It's breathed by God. The trouble is that God-breathed book has got some portraits of God that don't look anything like the God is revealed in Jesus Christ. And most Christians aren't aware of just how nasty some of this is, because preachers never preach on this and teachers hardly ever teach on this because they don't know what to do with that. And so most folks aren't aware of just how nasty some of the stuff is in the Old Testament. But you find portraits of God where he's commanding his people to engage in genocide and slaughter everybody in a certain region. You find other portraits of God where he says, slaughter everybody, but you can keep the virgins for yourself as to enjoy as spoils of war. You find portraits of God where he's orchestrating women getting raped and orchestrating parents cannibalizing their own children. 5 times you find that in the Old Testament. Portraits of God orchestrating soldiers ripping the unborn children out of their mother's wombs and things like that. Some really atrocious, horrendous portraits of God. And yet I have to believe that all this is God-breathed. So what do you do here? Yes, it looks like God's doing these horrendous things. But if I'm going to trust that God is fully revealed in Jesus Christ, I have to assume that something else is going on.